So, friends, we will move on to understanding contracts of guarantee as a special contract and followed with agency and sale of goods, which is covered under a law called the Sale of Goods Act of 1930. Now, all of these kinds of contracts are very, very important and relevant for multiple reasons that these define the contractual rights and liabilities of the parties in this contract. And to that extent, you will notice that it narrows the scope of what we call as the freedom of contract theory, defines a special type of contract, which in ordinary circumstances can be understood like this. Most of the contract friends are between two parties and we call them bilateral contracts, whereas contract of guarantee is a trilateral contract. It's a contract between three parties. And who are these three parties? You will notice that there is one debtor. Okay, who is the debtor who wants to take a debt? And he's a borrower. And in the contract of guarantee, he's called the principal debtor. We'll come to that, why he's called principal debtor. But he's the primary person who is intending to probably take a loan, or he wants certain performance of an obligation. He goes to a creditor who is willing to give credit, usually a bank or a financial institution. And you will notice that, when you look at creditors, the creditors want to secure their loan. They are not sure, because there is always a risk in contracts, a risk in loan agreements, that the debtor will not repay the loan back. And hence, what does the creditor do? Friends, normally the creditor would take a security. Now, if the security is mobile property, we call it pledge. If it's immobile property, we call it mortgage. There are other forms of security like charge, hypothecation, and others. Probably at this point of time, we should understand that property is kept as security. It is kept as some kind of a bond that if the debtor fails to pay the debt, the creditor can actually deal with that security and recover the debt. Normally, this kind of a transaction, if it involves a mobile property, we call it is the contract of pledge. Pledge means, we have already kind of understood this, saying you pledge gold and you want loan because you want liquidity, you want cash, and the loan is kept as the gold is kept as security. Interestingly, the creditors today want kind of a plan B in place. So what do? Is they tell the debtor, look, we are willing to give you loan. Fine, you should keep something as security, be it mobile property or immobile property. But we also want a person to stand as a guarantor for you. So this could be an additional condition, additional kind of a backup plan that the creditor should have to recover his loan. So what does the creditor do? He imposes this condition saying that unless a guarantor or a surety, who is supposed to be a person in the eye of law, comes in, we will not give you this credit. Now, surety or the guarantor comes into this contract to support the debtor. Please note the surety does not get anything in this contract. Interestingly, the law on consideration here says that the consideration to the debtor is the consideration for the surety. So no separate consideration needs to be proved. Why? Because this is a trilateral contract. So the consideration between the creditor and the debtor is sufficient consideration for the surety to come into the contract. So the guarantor or the surety steps in. He supports the contract. He is an important person in this contract because he says, look, whatever is the obligation between you both, I am there, I will support this contract. And in case the principal debtor defaults or fails to pay, I will pay. That's what the surety assures in such kind of a contract. Now, please note, it is obvious that, the debtor and the surety are in some kind of, pre-existing understanding or relationship, because, sureties or guarantors don't stand as guarantors for A, B, and C person. They have to know the person. They have to probably have some previous obligation towards that person. So it's the debtor usually who approaches this person called the surety and says, look, I need a loan. Will you stand as my guarantor? However, once the surety agrees to be a guarantor, his obligation is directly to the creditor. He says to the creditor, look, go ahead, give the loan to the debtor, and I will step in and I will stand and support this contract. So, obviously, if the surety is asked to pay, and this could be chances where the debtor defaults or fails to pay or is unable to pay or refuses to pay, then when the debtor does not fulfill his obligation towards the creditor, it is the surety or the guarantor who has to fulfill his obligation towards the creditor. And if the surety goes ahead and does the same, he can claim reimbursement from the debtor. Obviously, that is something that the law will have to come into place. Now, hence, friends, you will notice that the contract of guarantee chapter in the Indian contract law does not talk about the obligations of the creditor and the debtor, because that is already covered in the contract of pledge. Right? So pawner and pawnee, that's the word that we generally use in a normal kind of a contract of a loan agreement. But the chapter on guarantee is all about the surety. What is the rights of the surety? What are the liabilities of the surety? And what are the duties and obligation of the surety once it comes into the contract is laid down under this chapter. Going forward, you will notice that there are ordinarily two types of guarantee. And we should understand this because there are several kinds and types of guarantee. One of the most popular kinds is a bank guarantee, but that's later on. But in terms of the nature of the surety entering into the contract, I think guarantees can be divided into two categories. One is limited guarantee. Now, limited guarantee is for a single transaction, friends. It's for a limited period of time, because limited by what? Limited by time and limited by liability. So the surety here has a discretion to say that, look, I will join this contract provided my liability is limited. Now, look, what does this mean? It means that, look, the loan amount may be 1 lakh rupees, but the surety says, look, I will stand as a guarantee only for 50,000 rupees. So this is the limitation of liability that he can impose in this contract. He has the choice because he is coming into this contract, so he can limit his exposure, he can limit his risk, and he may decide to say that I will only stand for 50,000 and not greater than that, because that is his capacity, that is what he can extend. So he has a choice to actually exercise what is known as the choice of limited guarantee. Second, it could be limited by time in saying so that, look, I can be a guarantor for a year or two, not more than that. So you can try and limit that kind of guarantee, because generally when you look at certain kind of these transactions, then the surety does not want to expose himself for too long a period of time. Maybe he will say, look, within 2 years, if the debtor pays the debt to the creditor, that's fine. If not, I will have to exit. Whatever is the liability so far till that date, probably I'll pay it up. So limiting your liability is one kind of a choice that the surety can definitely make. Please note, the surety's consent in the contract has to be very, very clear. It has to be voluntary. It has to be free. And any kind of misrepresentation or fraud that may be committed for the surety's consent in this kind of contract of guarantee can make the contract voidable at the option of the surety. Now, quite different from limited guarantee is continuing guarantee. Under section 129, there are certain kinds of distinctive factors of defining what this continuing guarantee is. It's a guarantee that can extend to a series of transactions between the principal debtor and the creditor. So it's not one-time guarantee. It's not one-time transaction. It is for a series of transactions. For example, there is supposed to be supply of coal to a thermal plant for the next 3 years. And to assure the contractor's promise to supply this coal, there may be a surety who is brought in to support such a contract. He says, look, I will stand as a guarantor for the supply of coal for the next 3 years. That is a continuing guarantee, because each consignment of coal that is delivered is a transaction in itself. And you continue to be the guarantor for the next 3 years as the contracting party continues to exchange goods and services. That is what continuing guarantee means, and this can also be something that you can extend to what we call as an overdraft facility. Now, banks give overdraft facilities, so when they give this overdraft facility, it is like you have a lump sum amount, but you can withdraw it in installments. So again, there could be a continuing guarantee regarding the same. Now, one of the aspects of continuing guarantee is that you will have to notice that this kind of a guarantee can be revoked, unlike a limited guarantee or a one-time guarantee. Why? Because, once you enter into a contract of guarantee, you should be able to reconsider your decision. But that reconsideration of the right to revoke will only stand prospective, not retrospective, which means continuing guarantee can be revoked prospectively. So from now on, for this next series of transaction, I do not want to be, you can make a choice. But in a one-time guarantee, once you give your consent, you cannot revoke it back. And those are what we call as irrevocable guarantees. Second, the law also says that a continuing guarantee terminates on the death of the surety or the guarantor. Because remember, contract of guarantee is a personal character of promise, right? It's based on that kind of trust between debtor and surety. So if the surety dies, then the guarantee must stop, right? So you can't expect the obligation of surety to be inherited to the next of kin or to the legal heirs. So death amounts to termination of a continuing guarantee, and that is also making continuing guarantee slightly different from limited and other forms of normal guarantee as well. What you have to understand at this point of time is that there can be different other types of guarantees, which we probably, just to give you an example, we can talk about what is known as personal guarantee. The best example to explain what is personal guarantee is the job of a cashier in a bank. Now, during early days, the cashier's job was quite a risky job. There would be some kind of risk of he or she embezzling the cash, or misappropriating the cash, or running away with the cash, and hence the cashier's job would expect a guarantor or a surety to be brought into the employment contract. So if your contract or your employment is subject to a guarantor joining the contract, now you will be there for 2 years or 3 years. That's a kind of a possibility, and for those 2 or 3 years or for lifetime, there is a surety or the guarantor who comes in place and says, look, if he does something, I will compensate you, and this is the promise that I have for you. So in those cases, you will notice that it's a continuing employment or personal guarantee that is given for this cashier's job. And again, you can revoke it, but it is only prospective. So far, whatever is the liability or whatever fraud has been committed, you will definitely be responsible. So it is only prospective, and it stands to that extent as well. But in such kinds of guarantee, you will notice that you can have a combination of continuing guarantee and limited guarantee, because you will say, look, I will stand for the next 3 years or 5 years, but my exposure should not be more than his 2 times his salary. That is something that you can probably limit. Now, it's up to the bank or the employer to accept it, or say, okay, look, one surety wants to limit his guarantee. We do one thing, you get another co-surety. So the concept of co-surety is also existing in the contract law, and you will notice that when one or more sureties join a contract of guarantee, the co-sureties have what we call as joint and several liability. This could definitely be a possibility, as the case may be. Now, co-sureties, you will also find a lot of examples when directors stand as guarantors for a loan to be given to the company. Now, why should only one director stand? Now, all the directors or 2 or more directors may come together and say, look, please lend this loan to the company. We will stand as guarantor. If the company defaults, then we will pay. So the directors in themselves will become co-sureties. They have joint responsibility to discharge the default or the debt, and several in terms of course, whatever is their contribution, or equally, I think they will have to come into that kind of a transaction. So friends, it is quite pertinent now to understand the different instruments that are used in economic transactions, both nationally and internationally. It's important for us to understand the distinction between what we call as the contract of guarantee and instruments like letter of credit that is also used. Or maybe we can add one more terminology called letter of comfort. Now, let me start with letter of comfort. Friends, letter of comfort is generally issued when, say, a parent company wants to support the bid of a subsidiary company to get a contract from the government. It's like letter of support, right? Sometimes we say letter of comfort is like a recommendation letter. You need it, because without that, probably people will not trust you. You are new into the market, so you need those kinds of support. Where do you see letter of comfort? You can also see it in terms of, say, a contractor trying to submit a bid, and the government insists that the suppliers or the component manufacturers should also support that bid through this letter of comfort. Interestingly, letters of comfort are also bringing in a third party to the contract. So it's the government and the contractor, then you have the third party who comes and gives the letter of comfort. But letter of comforts usually are supporting documents, and please note, they can either be binding, they can be non-binding. So that's the advantage of letter of comfort. So a non-binding letter of comfort is not enforceable by law, but a binding letter of comfort will depend upon what are the wordings of that letter of comfort and how you can make it enforceable or binding. So that's what is the purpose of letter of comfort, and to be very honest, it's used quite widely. Say a parent gives a letter of comfort on behalf of the subsidiary to a bank, saying that you can lend to the subsidiary via the parent company. We will probably come and support this kind of a contract. Now, if they word the letter of comfort in a binding character, it can amount to a guarantee as well, because that is when the parent company then would probably stand as a guarantor or surety to the loan that is given to the subsidy company. So there are multiple use of these kinds of instruments in contracts because they are supporting documents. They're sometimes contractual documents in itself, and hence we must clearly understand where these applications come to. Coming to letter of credit, friends, you will notice that letter of credit is used for international transaction, whereas bank credit or bank guarantee is used for domestic transaction. How does letter of credit operate? The infamous case of Nirav Modi should actually probably tell us the kind of challenges that letter of credit have in international transactions. So the Nirav Modi case can be a case where people who are interested in contracts and corruption and criminal law can actually look forward to reading. But what does letter of credit do? It actually gives the seller a comfort or an assurance saying that please go ahead and sell goods to the buyer. We will ensure that you shall be paid. So it's a credit letter of the bank saying that, look, we hope the buyer will pay, but if he does not, you already have this letter of credit, and we as the bank who has issued this letter of credit will ensure that you, the seller, will be paid. So it's a credit line that a buyer takes, right? But it's not like taking money or loan or cash. It's like a letter. That's it, right? So normally when the seller sells these goods to the buyer, what happens in contract is the buyer will pay the price. What does letter of credit do? It is just an assurance that if the buyer fails, then the bank will pay the seller. So the seller will be assured that he will get his payment once he has dispatched the goods or once he has sent this goods to the buyer. So in international transaction without a letter of credit, why will a seller send goods? Because he's in a different jurisdiction, the buyer is in a different jurisdiction, the courts are a problem, enforceability becomes a challenge. So I think letter of credit actually supports such kind of transaction, and the sellers are assured through a letter of credit that they would be receiving payment, and that is some kind of a guarantee in one form, but mostly in international transactions. Finally, coming to guarantee, friends, what is important for you to understand is bank guarantee. Because this type of guarantee, friends, you will notice the bank is usually the creditor in our traditional kind of an example. But in a letter of credit, you will notice that the bank is the guarantor, right? In bank guarantee, the bank is the guarantor. So this is where the bank becomes a surety into the contract. Now, the bank becomes a surety in the contract for whom? It is usually to the government, which is floating the tender, right? So here we have creditor, which is a government agency, which floats a tender, which invites bids. And it tells all these bidders who are the debtors, look, we will give you the contract provided you give us a bank guarantee. Now, why does government take bank guarantee? It is because there is always this risk that the contractor or the debtor, as the case may be, may not complete the job, and he may create a loss to the government. So the government needs some kind of a risk assurance saying that if the contractor fails to perform or makes a deficient performance, then the bank guarantee will compensate the government at least to an immediate extent. Finally, going to the court, to the arbitrator, and get the final remedy will take probably some more time. But this is like an immediate kind of a compensation that can come through the surety or the guarantor or the bank guarantee that is actually issued in favor of the government. So bank guarantee, the bank is the surety. It gives an assurance to the government department or the government organization that we will pay in case the contractor fails to perform. Interestingly, some of the bank guarantees are called as performance bank guarantee, which means it is based on a condition that lack of performance will entitle the government to encash the bank guarantee. So that's how bank guarantee as a type also is an example that we can look into.